Good afternoon, everybody. We have now hit Berkeley time. We're going to get started. My name is Lisa Garcia Bedoya. I'm the director of the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Berkeley, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you today. It's wonderful to see such great turnout. I was saying, given today's the first day of the semester, and so it's wonderful to see people so interested in learning things after Christmas vacation. So we are honored today, as you all know, to welcome Martin Wolf to campus to deliver the R. Kirk Underhill Lecture. The Underhill Lecture is a signature event of the Anglo-American Studies program, which was established to promote scholarship and commentary on the enduring relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. Before introducing Mr. Wolf, I'd like to thank the Anglo-California Foundation for giving us the seed money that established the Anglo-American Studies program. Brad Botterer, who's here today in the front row, and Charlie Stevenson, who were former trustees of the Anglo-California Foundation, have been great friends to the program and to the Institute of Governmental Studies. It was their vision that is responsible for the creation of the AASP. You'll learn, if you haven't been at Berkeley very much, that we love acronyms for every possible thing. In addition to sponsoring the R. Kirk Underhill Lecture, the Anglo-American Studies program hosts a series of conferences on the historical and political relationship between the two countries, and we also award the R. Kirk Underhill Graduate Research Fellowship. So if there are any graduate students out there who study transatlantic relations, please be sure to apply to the fellowship. Applications are due January 31st. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of today's event, the Center for British Studies, the Institute of European Studies, the Center for Right-Wing Studies, and the Institute of International Studies, along with the British American Business Council. We appreciate everybody's support, and I think it was demonstrated in such a wonderful turnout today. Now turning to our main event, Martin Wolf is the Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator for the Financial Times. He was awarded the CBE, Commander of the British Empire, in the year 2000 for, quote, services to financial journalism and many other prestigious, for his service to financial journalism. He's also received many other prestigious journalism prizes. Too many to list here, but if you look at your program, they're all there for you to see in their glory. Reading his books and his column, it's not difficult to see why he's been the winner of so many awards. In addition to having an acute grasp of politics, he possesses a keen technical knowledge of economics. Once, when a commentator criticized him for favoring precision over ease of understanding, Wolf responded by drilling the reviewer on the differences between national debt and, quote, net external liabilities, concluding that he preferred writing something that is correct to writing something that is false. An especially important sentiment for our times. Not feeling compelled to dumb down his writing, Wolf adheres to the highest standards of financial journalism. Again, a model for the moment. Martin Wolf has written several books on global finance. His most recent, entitled The Shifts and the Shocks, What We've Learned and Still Have to Learn from the Financial Crisis, analyzes the causes of the Great Recession that impacted both the United States and Europe. In his book, he wrote, quote, the crisis became so severe largely because so many people thought it impossible. In this lecture, he focuses on two other widely unexpected developments, the election of Donald Trump here in the United States and the adoption of Brexit in the United Kingdom. I look forward to hearing his insightful and economic and political analysis of these developments in his Underhill Lecture, which is entitled From Brexit to Donald Trump, How Far Does the Economy Explain the Rise of Populism and Nationalism? I'm sure it will be a stellar presentation. Just so you know, we will be passing out index cards during the lecture where we would like to ask that you write down whatever questions you may have, and I will be curating those cards and giving him those questions during the question and answer session after his talk. If you could pass them to the end of the row when you're done, we'll pick them up and distribute them in time. So please join me in welcoming Martin Wolf.
Thank you very much. So that was a very, very kind magic of technology. Let's hope it works. This lovely introduction gave me two nice opening comments. The first was, I always say when I come, particularly to the United States, and I'm told, and people are told that I am a commander of the British Empire, my my remark is that it shows that whatever the British have lost, and they've lost a great deal, they haven't lost their sense of humor. Since there are probably not many people under 30 or even under 60 who can remember there ever was a British Empire. And the British, no doubt, will be continuing to give this award long after truly everybody has forgotten there was ever a British Empire. So it is a slightly humorous point. The commander of the British Empire, by the way, was invented during the First World War, which was really the decisive moment, I think, in the shift towards its end. So it's quite appropriate. It is sort of humorous. The other thing was the comment on my interaction with an unknown reviewer. It was actually the New York Times reviewer, was Felix Salmon. Felix is a good friend of mine, but he is sometimes pretty cavalier with the evidence, and in that case, dramatically so. So I hope this is not going to be the model for this lecture. I understand that last year, I don't know how many were present, you had Neil, who's also a very good friend of mine. I suppose one of the prices of my job is I meet an awful lot of interesting people of varying degrees of intellectual probity. And I'm not going to say any more about the last year's lecture, but I'm sure it was fun. I'm told that 2 days after he delivered the lecture, he made his famous volte-face on Brexit, having decided and told me on many occasions, I meet him quite often, that it was a terrible idea, that in fact it was a wonderful idea. I don't have the capacity for such flexibility, for better or worse. What I am going to do is something very, very dangerous, which I think only a journalist should attempt, which is amateur political science. It's more political science in a way than economics, because I'm trying to explain political processes. My excuse for this is that as a journalist, I don't have to reach the highest level of intellectual rigor, and politics, like economics, is far too important to be left, or the study of politics and the study of economics, to be left to professional academics alone. So I am very pleased to do this. My answer to this question is that, in my view, the economy explains a great deal. It doesn't explain everything, and I wouldn't dream of pretending that it does, but I think, and I hope I will persuade you, that it explains a great deal. And that raises some very big challenges for our future. I hope to finish this in about 45 minutes. I have quite a number of things to say, and if necessary, I will jump over a few things. The whole lecture, which has lots of text, which I'm not going to give you, one of my iron rules is never put bullet points on a screen, so you're going to have to listen to me. Will be available. I presume they can post it, so you'll be able to see what I would have said if I'd had more time. So let me start then with 3 introductory quotations. Initially, when I planned this, I had 6, but I got rid of 3 of them because my presentation was hitting God knows how many, 60 slides or so I got rid of most of them. Don't worry, you're not going to get that. So the famous remark about Great Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role is Dean Acheson. And of course, he wrote this at precisely the time, in fact, shortly after, a year after, if I remember correctly, maybe 2, that Harold Macmillan made a decisive decision. So we're talking a little bit about British history. I've come to the view that Harold Macmillan was the 3rd most important post-war prime minister. And one of his decisive decisions was that, having himself made the decision that the empire had to be disposed of completely and very quickly with his Winds of Change speech, he then said, and we must now join Europe, which of course, the EU, which of course the UK had refused to join in the 50s. And that took 11 years, because de Gaulle famously vetoed it. But we joined in 73, and we have been part of it with varying degrees of happiness and unhappiness ever since. And that's important because that was the answer that ultimately the British found for themselves. That's going to be our post-war role. We are going to be in part of the European project, and we've now rejected it. So the Dean Acheson question clearly has returned, because that answer to the question, which was actually put forward at exactly the same time that he made this comment, has now been abandoned. And since I don't believe Brexit will be reversed, it's conceivable, we can discuss that later, that's a pretty big moment. Right now, the post-war role that the British found for themselves has been rejected. The second quote, which is completely different, but I think is immensely important if we think about what is happening to British democracy and the British understanding of democracy, is a now already notorious headline from the Daily Mail, a newspaper that some of us at the Financial Times think doesn't quite meet our standards of intellect and probity, and therefore has far more influence than we do in the UK. They wrote a huge headline, which you can see online, in which they referred to the judges, High Court judges, who had ruled, think about this, had ruled in response to a famous suit that the government had to consult Parliament before notifying Brexit. That these people were enemies, that these judges, the judiciary, the core judiciary of our country, and this is a country in which the rule of law was quite a significant idea going back for many centuries, perhaps one might say all the way back to Magna Carta, that they were enemies of the people. That is to say, the legitimacy of a referendum, a constitutional novelty and innovation in the UK going back to the mid-70s, we never had them before, which the British had always regarded as an instrument of tyranny. The British had always regarded referenda as an instrument of tyranny, rightly so in my view, that has a long history. That the decision by the High Court that Parliament, whose sovereignty was supposedly to be re-established by Brexit, that Parliament had to be consulted by the government, that this decision showed that the judges were enemies of the people. And I think we can safely say, this is the most important conservative newspaper, that something pretty important had happened when they thought they could do that. And the third quote is entirely different, but is relevant to the economic side. And it's a very famous quote among economists, though it's not quite as elegant or punchy as the other two, as you'd expect, is about the dilemmas of running economies which have democratic institutions, which therefore ought to reflect the interests and views of the people at large, when you are also part of an increasingly integrated global economic system. And that's been a core theme of mine. It was a core theme of my book on globalization, published in 2004, and it's become clearly a far more important theme since. And he said that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. That's obviously true. There are trade-offs here, which is pretty clear. And Danny's view, of course, is that we've gone far too far on global economic integration, and it has undermined democracy and national sovereignty, and the politics are now showing this in different ways. Mr. Trump on the right responds to this with a sort of protectionist, anti-immigrant sort of standpoint, and of course people on the left, this is one of the things, would also agree for very different sorts of reasons. So these are my opening quotes. What I want to do is essentially cover four main things in the rest of my lecture. First, I'm going to talk about what I call a crisis of confidence, and just a sort of introduction to what I think are the main issues and why we should be concerned about the question I've raised, the British and American, what's going on in Britain and America. Then I will move to what is my main theme, is what I see as being the erosion of trust in a very large part of our body politic, in the competence and benevolence of our economic and political arrangements, and in particularly of the elites that run them. And I will discuss empirically, I'm going to give lots of data, I'm afraid, charts actually. The long-term process, the last 35, 40 years or so, and then what I think is crucial, what happened in the crisis, the impact of the crisis. Then if I have time, I'm going to touch very, very briefly, because I thought if I'm coming all the way to the US, what don't you know probably quite as much about as I do, what might happen in Brexit. And then there will be a very brief introduction of the broader picture challenges we now confront. So before I move on to the next chart, let me just say a bit about what I call the crisis of confidence. The main point I wanted to make here is it's obvious if you look out of there that the sort of political upsurge of what is called populism of the left and right, anti-elitism seems to me the core theme of populism, and lack of confidence in our leaders and economic arrangements is clearly visible to a greater or lesser extent in nearly all high-income Western countries. You can see it in France, you can see it in Italy, my God, you can see it in Italy, you can see it in Spain, more complicated, you can even see it in Germany with the extraordinary vote that the Alternative for Deutschland got in the last general election, you can see it in the Netherlands, my God, you can, in Austria, Sweden, and so forth. So in this respect, though I think, and I will argue, there are some special characteristics of the US and UK, we are not fundamentally different. Though I think there are certain respects in which the stresses within our societies and politics are somewhat exceptional, and I will be discussing what those are. So why should I focus on the US and UK? Why should we treat this as special? Why didn't I give a lecture on the whole developed world? Well, there is a trivial answer and a deeper answer. The trivial answer is this is about to be a lecture about the US and UK. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But to deal with that, I am actually in nearly all my data going to present the US and UK in the context of the developed world as a whole. What's different about them economically, and what is similar to the other countries, and particularly to the other large developed countries. So much of my focus is comparison with other members of the G7 grouping. But there's a more important reason, given what's been happening to Britain, because I would argue that in both Britain and the US, there is a profound, the political expression of the revolt, if you like, the revolt of the people that we are seeing. The political expression is a reaction against the post-war role of these countries. Even deeper, perhaps one might say a reaction in some cases, though I think this is more true here than in the UK, to the actual norms of the Republic itself. I'm not going to go further because I don't really want to make a lecture about the prospects for the democratic legal order in the US. That's beyond this lecture, though I have written a lot about it. But it seems to me clear that the UK has essentially rejected its post-war answer to what happened to Britain after empire. And we don't know whether this is permanent or temporary, but we now have an American president who has clearly and explicitly rejected most of the planks of American international policy making since, I would say, Pearl Harbor. So that's a good reason to focus on these countries. And the further reason, which is pretty obviously that if you look at the last 2 centuries, and particularly the last century or so, the US and UK, the biggest English-speaking democracies, were absolutely decisive in deciding the political outcome of the huge battles that marked the 20th century. But the battles against the German Empire, against fascism, and against the Soviet Union. So the US and UK, UK in the beginning, the US increasingly over time, were pivotal powers from the point of view of world order. So and the nature of the world order and the values underpinning that order, which I support in at least as ideals, and therefore if they have fundamentally changed their minds about what sort of countries they are and how they fit in, how their domestic institutions should work, for instance the shift, as I've mentioned in the UK, from representative democracy to direct democracy in the referendum, these are very profound shifts, probably of decisive global importance. And very much so because today there is an increasingly self-confident, authoritarian alternative being put forward. Just read Mr. Xi Jinping's speech in the last Party Congress, in which he explicitly enunciated the view that his Leninist capitalist model was an alternative and attractive model. So I would argue that what is happening to the US and UK is very politically significant, not only for them, but for the wider world. So there's a good reason, I think, to focus on the questions that I am mentioning. So let me move on then to the second thing, the erosion of trust. There is a long, as I've discovered in writing about this, a very, very substantial political science versus economics debate, absolutely classic, about whether one should see the drivers of the changes in politics that I have been discussing, views on how society should be run, views on the economy, attitudes to protection, attitudes to parliamentary democracy. Is this essentially a cultural revolution, or is it an economically driven revolution? And I don't want to get into this in vast detail, except to say that in my view, it is simply impossible to separate the two phenomena. So to give you an example, when people think about immigration, they are clearly thinking, a lot of people who react against immigration, they are thinking about cultural change, they're worried about the possibility that people will arrive who don't fit in some way. But it is also obvious to anyone who studies this that immigration is an economic phenomenon driven by economic forces with economic consequences. Similarly, and I'll come to this in a moment, there is obviously a long-term sense among many men, particularly in what we would call the working class, that they are in decline culturally. They are less regarded. But I would argue, and I will argue, that a lot of that is rooted in profound economic changes which genuinely affect them. It's an economically driven processes. So I would go further in that, but the crucial point I want to make is that the distinction between culture and economics doesn't seem to me very useful. They are mutually interacting in profound ways, and I suppose that's a perspective that Karl Marx would certainly agree on, and it's one I happen to believe is correct. So with that, I want to ask the question, why might long-term processes longish-term processes have created a sense that the country is no longer being run for the benefit of the sort of people who found it attractive to vote for Brexit, and we know a lot about who they were, and a lot of the people who thought that it was sensible to make Mr. Trump the Republican nominee and then vote for him. So one of the factors I suggest, one of the well-known factors, is concern about immigrants. So I put together, these are unfortunately the most recently available data from the OECD. So we don't have data for the proportion of foreign-born people in major developed major countries after 2013 on a comparable basis. The country for which that's most important, the emission is most important, is Germany, because they had, of course, a very large influx very recently, and that has undoubtedly affected their politics. Interestingly, when I looked at this, there are three things that strike out. First of all, in every one of these countries, the proportion of the foreign-born has been rising. Secondly, in the US, it's really been rather mild. In fact, the proportion of the foreign-born in the US relative to the population is, as I understand it, considerably lower than it was in the late 19th century. Completely different from all the other developed countries, except Canada, which is, of course, like the US, but has a very high immigrant ratio. All the developed countries of Europe have shifted into being net recipients of immigrants in a large way, really quite recently. So actually on these data, and I must say it is important, that why the US has suddenly got so worked about immigration isn't obvious to me. It may be, and you can discuss this later, this has to do with the so-called illegality of it, the lack of control. But the UK is striking for what is actually a very, very large change, unexpected, mainly relating to EU immigration, and I have no doubt that was a significant factor. The country that is really surprising on the other side, we can discuss why, but I don't have time to go into further, is Spain. Spain has an absolutely colossal increase in immigrants, and it has not become an issue in the politics at all. There was a very large rise in Sweden, and it is a very big issue in Sweden. So, at least in the case of the UK and Sweden, I understand what's happening. In the case of the US, I don't fully, and Spain is a big puzzle. The second process, which seems to me extremely important in understanding longer-term trends, is called globalization. Now, there's a lot to be said about globalization, and I can't talk about every aspect, but I think the important point to make here is the point that Richard Baldwin has brought out very, very well in his wonderful book, The Great Convergence, which is that as a result of liberalization of trade and technological change, and the ability to shift production essentially anywhere in the world, and above all to cheap labor areas, the bargain between capital and labor within what you might call national capitalist systems has been dissolved over the last 40 years or so. And workers find themselves increasingly competing for, as it were, the privilege of being employed by domestic know-how and domestic capital, by the people who have know-how and capital, they're competing with people all over the world. And one of the best indicators of that, I think, is what's happened to global value chains, the unbundling of production, the incorporation of foreign value added in trade. So this is just one measure of globalization. Again, the interesting thing to me, sort of puzzle about the US, is that on this dimension, the US is not dramatically affected. This is the US here. Clearly, the rise of global value change has been significant, but because it's a very large economy, relatively remote from most other economies, this rise of global value chains has been a relatively small part of activities. It's been dramatic across Europe. It's very high in the UK as well. So this dimension of globalization doesn't seem to explain what's been happening in the US very powerfully. It seems more plausible in the UK, but it's not an exceptional story in the case of the UK. But now we get to something which does seem to me really very, very striking. And that is the collapse of manufacturing as a source of employment in the developed world generally, but quite particularly in 3 countries where concern about this has clearly been a very important feature, it seems to me, of the domestic political debate, namely the US, the UK, and France. The decline of manufacturing as a source of employment has been dramatic across the developed world over about 40 years. It has proceeded particularly rapidly in the UK, US, and France. These were countries where the share of manufacturing employment was 30% plus 40 years ago. It's now down to, I think, 8% in the US, 9% in the UK, about 10% on France. This is a really big long-term structural shift in the economy with dramatic effects on a very important part of the workforce, predominantly male, semi-skilled workers who previously enjoyed quite high pay in usually heavily unionized industries, which often gave pretty continuous employment, secure employment, and rather high wages. The disappearance of this form of employment is a fundamental transformation of the labor force and a fundamental transformation of job opportunities for a very significant part of the labor force. And this part of these people affected by this were clearly very important parts of the anti-Brexit coalition, because they went with the Conservatives. They were not Conservatives historically. They went with with UKIP and Brexit, supporting Conservatives in this issue, and many of them have now broken with the Labour Party. And very similar things, as I read it, have happened in the US. So the progress of deindustrialization seems to me a very profound long-term structural shift, which does potentially explain what has been happening. A fourth factor, which again I think marks out the British and particularly the Americans very decisively, is rising inequality, long-term secular increases in inequality. I've got a number of indicators of that, but this is a fairly nice, neat one. It comes from the famous Wealth and Income database. It takes I've taken the top 10%, not the famous top 1%, and it shows very clearly for the US, and uniquely for the US, but to some degree the data is much more partial also for the UK, essentially a very long-term U-shaped curve. A massive decline in inequality, the share going to the top 10% in the pre-First World War period, collapsing down during the war and immediately afterwards to far, far lower levels. In 1970, the US was well in the middle of the other developed countries. There's nothing exceptional about it. And then a huge and marked rise in this share, dramatic in the US, so that by the 2013, half of all income accrued to the top 10%. And the UK, until the crisis, had a very similar path. This was not, it seems, an inevitable path, because you can see for France, where we also have a long-term series, it collapsed and it's never gone up. France was actually, interestingly, in the early 60s, I remember thinking about that one of the most unequal countries, and it's now one of the most equal countries. So the return of inequality, the scale of inequality, and its increase seems to me an important dimension of the long-term trends. And that fits very well with the picture for cross-sectional inequality. This is measured by the famous Gini coefficient for household disposable income, what people actually get. And though the differences aren't massive, the US is clearly at the top and the UK is second. These are the most unequal of the large developed countries. Spain is quite close, interestingly, and Japan and Italy are not far behind. Germany and Sweden and France are in really quite a different position. So both the change in equality and the level are salient and important features of the UK and US. In the UK, the rise in inequality, by the way, occurred in the Thatcher Revolution. It hasn't got worse than that. In the US, the evidence is that it is ongoing. Now, this is a slightly puzzling chart, but I think it has one very useful indicator of what is special about the US compared with other developed countries. This shows income inequality in 2010. It's the most recent year for which I found this data. It's from the famous lump sum income study. The market income distribution is the yellow column. These are all Gini coefficients again. The black column is disposable income after tax and spending, and the grey column, therefore, by implication, is the difference between the two, and it is a demonstration of how active government is in ameliorating the pre-tax distribution. To my surprise, so there is something about these data I don't understand. This shows that the US is not extraordinarily more equal in pre-tax income distribution than the others. In fact, the UK, surprisingly, is shown as somewhat more unequal. But I have ranked these countries by how much intervention there is to shift the pre-tax to the post-tax, and the US intervention is much smaller, and as a result, the distribution of disposable income is much more unequal than in the other countries. The UK, interestingly, comes out of these studies, and that's not that surprising given the nature of our welfare state, as relatively interventionist in shifting income from the pre-tax spend situation to the post-tax situation. And the final statistic, which I think is most revealing for the US, and is, I think, incredibly important for the US, but relates to success in generating jobs. This actually is a reflection of long-term trends, but I'm going to focus on where we were in the most recent period. These data are for 2016. I'm sorry that they're not up. This shows the proportion of men and women aggregated together between the ages of 25 and 54, that is prime age adults who usually have responsibilities for families. They're the people whom it's most important to have in employment. And the remarkable thing in this is that the US employment ratio for people aged 25 to 54 is significantly below that in France, significantly below that in Canada, the UK, Japan, and Germany. The figure, by the way, this is true for both men and women. The difference between the US and Italy and Spain, in large measure, is the still very low employment ratios for females in those countries. So the US, it seems to me pretty clear, is doing a rather bad job at generating jobs for prime age adults. So that's the erosion of trust as far as long-term trends are concerned. And when you look at that, it seems to me reasonably clear that in terms of inequality, in deindustrialization and employment, the US and UK to have very, very substantial problems. Now let me talk about what happened in the crisis. I regard the crisis as a pivotal event in the acceptability of the modern capitalist system virtually everywhere. It's something that shocked everyone, because so far as the people at large were concerned, this just shouldn't have happened. They were told to trust the market system, market capitalism. What then happened was an enormous financial crisis, which required a colossal rescue by the government of the financial system itself, which had caused the crisis, and Many people lost their jobs. I'm going to come to this in a minute. Incomes stagnated, but the perception was and is that the financial sector was rescued. I think the psychological blow, if you like, the political and psychological blow was particularly severe in the UK and US because these economies, these were the countries which had the world's largest financial systems, the world's largest financial centers, and which had been persuaded or told that this was the future in terms of the economy. Basically, when the financial system imploded, all the Frenchmen I know basically responded saying, well, of course it did. That's what you'd expect. But for us, it was a huge psychological and political blow. And that is, I think, something very, very important in the hinterland of American and British thinking. But this basically brings out the fundamental point, and it only goes to 2016, is that we had a huge recession in terms of GDP per head across the entire developed world in 2009. We then had a recovery. The German economy did far better than anybody else, which is why until the immigration crisis things were reasonably happy there. The Japanese haven't done, the Canadians have done pretty well, but if you look at the British and Americans, that's the next to the blue and the greenish one, yes, they've done better than Italy and Spain, which were massively hit. Spain is now shooting back, but they basically had 10 years of near general stagnation. GDP per head in the US and UK in 2016 was about 3 or 4% higher than it had been 10 years before. Next to no growth whatsoever. Furthermore, though unemployment in these two countries, that's the green and black line, had fallen a long way back towards where it had been before, this followed an enormous spike. The US spike is absolutely colossal. The green line shows this. A pretty large spike in the UK too. And it took a very long time before the unemployment rate fell back to where it had been before the crisis. Very nearly 10 years. By the way, the shock of this huge spike in unemployment has affected, I think, all the developed countries in Europe. The only country not to have been affected is Germany, of the big countries, for the simple reason that there wasn't one. No such spike ever occurred in Germany. And that's one of the reasons, again, until the immigration crisis came along, that everything looked so fantastically stable. So the crisis was a demonstration of a failure of the financial economic system. It led to quite inequitable solutions to that crisis from the point of view of the public. It led to economic stagnation, I'm going to come to that a bit more, and high unemployment. This to me is one of the most striking charts about both the general malaise in the West and what's happened to the US and UK. So this comes from an interesting study done by McKinsey. They actually looked at the question, what is the proportion of households that have had flat or falling incomes, real income from wages and capital, overwhelmingly obviously from wages, between 2005 and 2014. And you can see in Italy it was nearly 100%, in America it was 81%, in the UK it was 70%. So it was not merely that GDP per head stagnated, most people in our economies experienced stagnant or falling real incomes during the crisis periods. Worse than just median income stagnation. It's an almost everyone except the very top elite stagnation. Sweden is a striking exception, but similar ratios can be seen in many other developed countries. And the final indicator, which I thought is very interesting, which the US and UK share, is what I call the austerity index, namely the scale of tightening of the fiscal position. A lot of that is cutting of public spending following the crisis. And this I've measured by the change in the structural fiscal balance since the crisis. So the red bar going down, column going down, shows the scale of the structural fiscal deficit after the crisis. It was huge in the US and UK, mainly because financial sector revenue was such an important part of the revenue basis. Then the green shows what it got to in 2016, and the purple line above shows the implicit structural fiscal tightening. And you can see the US and UK have had exceptionally large structural fiscal tightenings since the crisis hit. Again, they're very much in a class of their own. When we put all this together in a very simple way, we just started, let's take a whole range of the indicators, the exposure to globalization, the rise of foreign-born in the population, inequality, the scale of rising inequality, the scale of the financial crisis impact, the post-crisis recovery, the level of unemployment created by the crisis, the discouragement of prime-age workers. We sort of ranked each country on a scale of simply 1, 2, and 3, and the summation then shows the higher the 3 is the worst, the higher you are, the more unhappy the economic short-term and long-term performance is like to make you. And Italy would clearly be the worst, particularly if you've got rising inequality there. We don't have data. Germany would clearly be the best, but the UK and US come pretty high. So the conclusion from this is fairly straightforward. All the developed countries have, to a greater or lesser extent, suffered very large economic stresses over the last 30 or 40 years. All of them experienced a pretty big financial crisis shock. Some countries have done better than the others. On both of those criteria, the UK and US have done pretty badly, not dramatically badly, but pretty badly. And that's particularly true for the US on employment generation, deindustrialization, and inequality, and for the UK on inequality and deindustrialization, and both of them share this profound shock associated with the destruction of credibility of the financial sector as a whole. So it seems to me my answer to the question that I posed is yes, to some significant degree, economic developments can explain not only the general malaise of political credibility, trust in elites of the developed world as a whole, it can also explain to a significant degree why the UK and US seem to have been relatively badly affected. In what I have left to say, let me just discuss, moving from that to the key question, a sort of passing point. What is this decision that we've taken as a result of this? I think without the crisis and the economic malaise, the Brexit vote would have gone the opposite way. It was only a 4 percentage point margin. I think these things that I've discussed were decisive in shifting the margin in the way it was, the way it did, and I stress the immigration. What is the likely consequence of the decision for the UK? At the end of this, we are going to leave the EU. We are almost certainly going to leave the single market. We will ultimately, I think, leave the customs union. So we will end up in a free trade agreement with the EU, which will not cover services and will look rather like NAFTA. The NAFTA that still exists for the moment. A woman called Monique Abel gave quite a good analysis of what that might do. It's of course questionable just before the referendum. And basically she concluded that the goods, ceteris paribus, goods trade would shrink by 20%, services by 26%, and total trade by 22%. I don't know whether these numbers are precisely correct, but it is certainly plausible that our integration into the European economy is about 40% of our trade, will shrink very substantially over the next 10 years, if this is what happens, and that will have a large negative effect on the performance of the economy. She also argued that there were no conceivable changes in free trade agreements with the rest of the world which will offset this. It is worth noting that Britain does more trade with the EU than with all the rest of the developed world put together. So, I mean, by a very large margin, about 40% more than with all the rest of the developed world put together. So the chances that other deals will offset this is effectively zero. The effects on the economy are very, very controversial, but these are some of the assessments that were done at the time of the referendum, and I think they are plausible. There was a distinction made between what might happen to the short-term economy by 2020 and what will happen in the long term. From the basis of what we're seeing so far in our economy, we were the slowest growing G7 economy last year. The measures put forward by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research and the London School of Economics, which is a reduction of 1.2% to 2% of GDP relative to what would otherwise have happened, looks plausible. In the long run, it depends on how dramatic the shrinkage of trade is and how big the effects that will have on the economy. From what we can see at the moment, we really don't know. You can see estimates vary between a shrinkage of 2% of GDP by 2030 and a shrinkage of 8%. Of course, it matters a lot what the baseline is. The baseline for growth of the British economy at the moment looks to be about 1.5% a year. So an 8% reduction in GDP, if the economy is growing otherwise 1.5% a year by 2030, you can do the maths fairly easily, means that we will lose something like 2/3 of our output relative to what it would otherwise have been. That strikes me a bit excessive, but it would mean that growth would then be well under 1%. And of course, the people who voted for Brexit will be the main victims. Let me just finally put this together. What am I trying to say? As a result of economic changes in the long run and in short run, I believe that our politics have become fundamentally fragile. What do I mean by fragile? I mean anything can happen. And we have seen that sort of thing happen before. It happened to many countries in the 1930s. I don't expect this to change because the economic forces driving us in that direction, above all in dividing outcomes so sharply in our population and disappointing so many people of their hopes for the future, the underlying economic drivers are not going to get better and could well get worse. So this state of fragility will endure. As long as the state of fragility will endure, anti-elite politics will continue to be attractive, even if the anti-elitism is completely faux populism, completely inauthentic populism. It will work because you're plugging directly into angry and understandably angry and frustrated people. So that will guarantee that this will continue. The populist response, this is my second main point, can take two sorts of forms. One which I regard as welcome and desirable, and one I regard as pernicious and destructive. The welcome and desirable one would take the form of saying, things have gone wrong, we have failed to create economic and systems which give the great majority of our people hope in the future. And if we don't change that, our democratic political systems are in very serious danger. So we must reform. And those reforms have to be more radical than the ones we've been thinking of so far. That seemed to me a benign form of populism. The malign form of populism, of course, takes the form of exploiting anger in Brexit vote against foreigners in particular. That was the characteristic. It was the Europeans, it was immigrants who were at fault, blaming foreigners, blaming out-of-touch elites, and giving trust to populist charlatans. So let us think Boris Johnson, or possibly, conceivably, somebody closer to home here. So that's the second big point. The third big point I want to make at the end is a lot of the pressure here will be towards nationalism and towards, therefore, closing our systems. And I think that's true on the left and the right. But I would stress this, the need for running the globe in a cooperative way, given the scale of global public goods we have to deliver, security, climate, managing climate and so forth, the need for a global cooperative outcome in many, many areas continues to increase. Even in the benign form, a more inward-looking populist sort of response to what's happening is going to make that more difficult. In a malign form, the whole structure of global cooperation can break down, and that is where I started when I said the key thing to me is that the two countries which shared a sort of vision, very imperfect, through much of the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, of a belief in democracy, liberal markets, not absolutely free markets, but liberal markets, the rule of law, international cooperative institutions shown in America's commitment to the whole Bretton Woods structure in the UN, Britain's commitment ultimately to joining Europe. These two countries are no longer there anymore. And that is going to make the world and the future of the values that at least I hold dear far more uncertain and far more dangerous. I would have liked to have given you a more cheery lecture, but that's how I see it. Thank you for listening.
So the first is kind of a big picture question, which I'm going to enhance a bit, so forgive the person who wrote it. But to what extent do you think that U.S. government policy, driven by a certain sector of elites within the United States, is responsible for the trends and changes in manufacturing and jobs that you've talked about? And in what ways will they suffer if the United States steps back from that role, given its influence in international political and economic markets? Or have they reached a point where they're no longer dependent upon the nation state in the way that they were initially?
And we're talking particularly here about deindustrialization?
Deindustrialization.
The interesting thing about the process of there are two things that come out of that very simple chart, which I've sort of fairly clear. And I have another chart which I got rid of, which shows the trends in Germany and America since, I think, 1970. And the interesting thing about that is that the trend of the charts for Germany and America are essentially the same, the trend in the chart, but Germany's consistently about 10 percentage points above the US. So now, there's no doubt German manufacturing has been quite extraordinarily successful in terms of output. It runs a colossal surplus in manufacturing. So it's been about as successful as it could have been. Nonetheless, there has been enormous deindustrialization in Germany. So and that's mainly driven, the bulk of that has been driven or essentially the trend has been driven by the combination of the extremely rapid rises in productivity in manufacturing, which are ongoing, and the fact that in rich countries, what economists would call the income elasticity of demand for manufacturers is relatively low. So the result is, a friend of mine, actually an American friend who lives in Britain, wrote a piece for a very wonderful article, I thought, which in the early 90s, in which he basically argued that manufacturing is the new agriculture. That in the end, and I think it's clear, we're very close to it, that manufacturing will generate 1% of the employment, maybe, because everything is going to be done by machines. Everything. Superimposed on that is the changes in the trade balance. Because if you have a huge surplus in manufacturers, you will have more industry, your plants, you will have more of this sort of industrial jobs, and if you have a huge trade deficit in manufacturers, it will be the reverse. It is the case that the US and UK have very, very large trade deficits in manufacturing, a lot of it actually with other developed countries, though also with China, while Germany has an enormous surplus. So the trade policy, in terms of its effects on the balance of trade in manufacturing, has been a secondary factor, secondary in scale, but a secondary factor in showing the levels of employment in manufacturing as a share of the total. I don't want to, by the way, suggest that manufacturing is the only sort of good job. I don't want to fetishize manufacturing, but it seems to me simply a matter of fact that the employment opportunities manufacturing afforded, particularly for middle-skilled men, were socially very important, and the disappearance has been very profound. So my response to the question is, there are profound structural things going on in our economies which are going to continue to shrink manufacturing as a share of employment and as a share of the economy, at least at market prices. But of course they have been affected. It's just simply a fact. They've also been affected by trade. And there's I discussed this in my notes, there's been a very interesting debate in America on the so-called China shock. Okay? Which seems to have been particularly severe in the US. I haven't seen comparable data for the developed countries in Europe, but the China shock seems to be significantly smaller, and that's clearly a trade policy effect. Is it the case that when China was invited into the WTO in 2000, ultimately joined in 2001, people didn't think about that very much? Yes, I think the case is they didn't think about it very much.
And what about inequality? Do you see that mapping on
manufacturing? The inequality is a different thing. There are a lot of things that went on to drive inequality. As I've shown you, the trends among developed countries have been quite divergent. There is no developed country in which either pre or post-tax distribution of income on any standard measure has got more equal since the 70s. I think basically nobody. The country that's closest to that is France, but basically everywhere it's got more unequal. And that's because, again, very big processes operating our economies towards making our economies more skill intensive, for reducing the value of this sort of middle skilled person, the trade effects, as I said, the growth of the financial sector and its role. These have been common, and they have tended in the direction of greater inequality. That's sort of universal. But the differences in the degree of the increase in inequality has been, both pre-tax and post-tax, have been very, very large. So it seems to me reasonably clear that policy must have played quite an important role in the outcome. And quite arguably, I've come to this view, not a standard economics view, that social norms have also been relevant. To give you a very obvious example, what a chief executive officer of a company is paid cannot be determined by normal competitive market processes. Companies are complex entities. There are norms at work which determine how much a chief executive might be paid and how his pay or her pay is structured. US chief executive pay for people in essentially similar business is extraordinarily much higher than anywhere else. So if you compare the chief executive of Exxon with the chief executive of Shell, it's very, very striking. That's just an example. Those are social norms. So they're process of social norms. There are technical and there are political processes relating to how the tax and benefit taxes and welfare system, broadly defined welfare system, work, which lead to different outcomes. The US, I think, and the UK to a significant degree too, made decisions which had the outcome of increasing inequality quite radically. There's a lot of controversy about how important that has been in shaping public attitudes. And all the evidence we have in the US is that this is a smaller concern than in European countries. But my view is, and I'm just focusing on the politics of it, is that even in the US, people are prepared to accept fully, this is clearly a country in which inequality is accepted as quite normal part of the market economy, even extreme inequality. But the combination of high and rising inequality with the sense that a large part of the economy is rigged for the benefit of elite people, particularly after the financial crisis, is very, very destructive. And I didn't talk about that aspect of the banking sector, the fines and all the rest of it. So it seems to me that, again, there are gigantic economic forces at work that are driving the direction of higher inequality. All the serious analysts tend to believe that this will continue, but how far it actually works out in the economy and how it works out in the economy does also depend on policy choices and social norms.
So building on social norms, it looks like your framing of trust resonated very much with our audience. So I have a few questions centered around trust, in particular, whose trust is being eroded. And so at least within the UX context, if you look at the analyses after the election, it actually wasn't people who were in economic dire circumstances that in fact supported Trump. Racial resentment and other things actually played a much bigger role. So I'm curious if that has been true in the UK, and generally, since you say that our future is sort of ethno-nationalism and populism, among whom and to what extent does race play an important factor in that development?
My perception but I'm not an expert on the poll evidence, but my perception is that Trump voting people and Brexit voting people were not so dissimilar. So a lot of them were just traditional conservative folks supporting, in the British case, the British sovereignty, and here, the Republican side. And a lot of them were people who were not at the bottom. I think the poor clearly didn't in either side, but who were relatively uneducated and who felt insecure, concerned about the fate of their children, and concerned that there was sort of a chasm opening beneath them into which they might fall. They felt that they had a lot to lose, either them or their children. And to me, and I've already, as I said, I don't want to separate the economics from the attitudes. I don't want to sort of get into how much of it is one and how much of it is other. My sense of it is that when people are angry and or feeling insecure, and that seems to me very clearly what was happening in the UK, which I understand best, then identity politics become for them too more important. So I don't think that the ethnic attitudes are separate from those sense of anxiety and fear. And it does seem to, it's quite true that a lot of the people who voted weren't at the very bottom, as I already said. But it's, to me, again, very, very striking that in London, the richest and most diverse area, everybody was strongly against Brexit. And it was in areas which were clearly in economic decline, clearly where people were very anxious about the future for them and their children, which I think has also happened in parts of Pennsylvania and places like that, where people ended up voting in this way. So it does seem to me plausible that economic concerns were quite significant for an important part of the people who voted in this direction. In the Brexit case, as I said, my own view has been that at least a third of the population were again, probably 35 to 40, 30%, a third of the population have been against the EU forever. There's nothing changed in that. The question that you have to ask yourself, what made another 18% or so shift? And I think these are the things I discussed were crucial. And the most important thing here, in the British case, again, I don't want to, because I don't want to go into too far into the politics of a country I don't know anything like so well, is a crucial element of what happened in this vote was when these people all decided to vote against Brexit. The whole establishment, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, most of the political leaders, the business elite and so forth, they all said, this will be a disaster. This will be a disaster. And I genuinely think that 10 or 15 years earlier, that would have been an effective argument, right? But after what has happened, not only did it cease to be an effective argument, it was an anti-argument. People felt, well, if these guys all think that we should stay in, there must be something wrong with it. And that's what I mean by the breakdown in trust. And it does seem to me, it's not about, I mean, I think any Republican candidate would have got a lot of votes. You know, that's obvious. But why was it Mr. Trump who was the candidate rather than somebody like Jeb Bush? Why did he run on this nativist sort of platform and so successful and happily? That clearly shows that in the community to which he was responding and the people at the margin, what he had to say was attractive in a way that I would have thought 20 years ago would never have worked. And that suggests to me that something has changed, and that something has changed is pretty damn significant. What has changed on both sides is that a very large part of the electorate are looking for people who will cock a snook at, as we would say, at the elite.
You may want to translate
who
for
will,
the American English speakers.
There must be an American equivalent. Who will cock a snook at the elite because they wanted to give what they thought of as the elite a really good kicking. And that seems to me precisely what happened in the Brexit vote. And that's why they supported somebody like Boris Johnson, who's a chancellor and a fraud, and whom I know pretty well. And that's what happened. So I do think something really quite important has happened in terms of the fundamental trust between a very large part of the populace and the elite. And if that had not happened, I can't see how Mr. Trump will be president. And I certainly don't think we would have had Brexit, because we would have followed the Prime Minister. By the way, sorry to add this, most pundits on politics, this is why I've got into this, argued for precisely this reason Mr. Cameron would win, because in the end the British follow the lead of their elite. And normally they do. That's part of the British structure. And they looked at Mr. Cameron and said no.
So the question is then, do you see those sort of middle-skilled workers driving the politics of the future? And if they are, how does one, as a political leader, potentially rebuild that trust? Is it possible?
Well, the optimists in Britain, so I won't talk about America here because that's your problem.
We have little optimism
you have
these days.
The optimists in Britain argue that these people are all going to die out. Essentially,
how quickly?
Essentially, a large part of the unhappy people are over 40, right? And a very large part over 60.
And the life expectancy.
And the youngsters, the under 40s, voted strongly in favour of staying in. This may be because they feel more nostalgia for the old world which is gone. They remember the old world that has gone, and they want it back, and the youngsters don't. And the youngsters are angry too. I mean, they just give an enormous vote for Mr. Corbyn. I haven't even discussed the possibility that our next Prime Minister will be a Marxist. It's perfectly in fact, I think it's the most probable outcome. So I haven't even got to that, which I suppose...
Well, we've got 3 minutes.
I suppose that's the equivalent to Mr. Sanders becoming...
Sanders, yeah.
Sanders, although I presume they would have to find someone slightly younger, but you seem to be going into gerontocracy too. But that's part of the loss of trust on the left too, right? The rejection of the centre and the Democrat... Is a candidate with Hillary Clinton sort of positions going to become a presidential candidate with the Democrats again? I can't believe it, but you will tell me. So the point is, on both sides, it goes to extremes. Lots of very angry people. But the optimistic view would be that the angriest people will die out. That's particularly relevant to Britain. The youngsters are more adjusted to the idea that we are a European country. We're not going to be a great imperial power again. There isn't a global option for the UK except through Europe, which seems to me reasonably obvious. That's what we are now. And the European countries, for all the differences, and they're important differences, are more like us than anywhere else. And so we should be part of it. I think people under 40 largely accept that. And the optimistic view, so that's on Brexit. But on the bigger issue that you raise, can we run our economies in such a way that the great majority of our people feel comfortable with the promises it gives them and their children for the future? And not just for the really successful, but for the great majority. Well, my reading of this is, if you look at the underlying trend growth of our economy, which is quite modest, if you look at the pressures created by aging, which are very severe in all our countries, if you look at the changes that technology is driving in manufacturing goes to 1%, robots everywhere, which I think is genuine, that the likelihood of creating an economy which naturally, without really very major engineering, generates very good opportunities in the middle of the income distribution, so the middle class in your terms, is really quite small. It's really going to be very difficult to do this. I think most serious analysts will conclude this. So my perception now is that we can presumably avoid another huge financial crisis, presumably. I'm not confident of it, because there is still a lot of stress in our financial system. We're still more indebted in most countries than we've ever been before. Even in the US, it's shrunk very little. In households and in corporates, it's exploded. So there's a lot of fragility in the financial system if something goes seriously wrong. But leaving aside a financial crisis, that passes away, people will forget that. People will be more optimistic because we haven't had a financial crisis for 20, 30 years. That'd be great. But in terms of actually generating an economy that will grow strongly, positively, and consistently and generate lots of good remunerative employment in the middle of the income distribution, I don't think we have the answer to that anywhere and in the developed world. And so I'm not wildly optimistic. I think it will need a lot of really quite creative and intelligent policy making, and I don't see where that's going to come from.
Since our time is up, I'm going to give you an opportunity to perhaps express
But we've got to.
optimism.
I want to give. No. I regard this as the challenge.
Yeah.
So I'm writing a book about this, about things we could do, some of which are quite radical. These are not things that I would have thought of 15 years ago. But I think the challenge, I think it's very important. If I look at Britain, we're not going to reverse Brexit. We're stuck with this. But if I look, we might have Corbyn, okay? I don't know where the US is going to go. That would be but I think it would be a terrible mistake for reasonably well-intentioned people who want our system to work well, who believe in our core values, as I do, to assume that making this work will be easy. This is just a blip. It's an abnormal blip. Everything's going to go back to normal 4 or 5 years from now, when we've got through Brexit, the next presidential election, whatever it might be. I think it will be a profound mistake to believe that. So I may be pessimistic, but I suppose my response, which is rather méchant, is it's better than facile optimism.
On that happy note. Thank you all for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Mr. Wolff.